Hello, friends, and welcome to the June 1st edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness. And y'all, we're scheduled to kick off a series on public education policy today with a conversation on vouchers and charter schools, but we just can't. We just can't spend this week talking about numbers after the horrific shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde. Many of you know that I'm a parent of 2 public school children. Like many of you, I spent the last week thinking about how I would respond if that was our school. Shannon and I looked at pictures of the memorials and saw our faces on the faces of the parents. We were looking at pictures of children running from the school, pictures of kids who are terrified, pictures of kids with blood on their clothing, and we wondered what our children's faces would have looked like in a similar situation. We were in both of our children's schools just that day. I saw pictures of the father holding the picture of his daughter with an honor roll certificate while I was putting my son's honor roll certificate on the refrigerator and just lost it. Don't tell my daughter, but during her band concert that evening, in the local high school, I was scrolling through Twitter, looking at the news while in the middle of her middle school band concert, and then looked up at the stage and reflected on all of the innocent faces sitting up there. The face of my daughter, the face of her friends. We have all personalized this, and we wonder why it keeps happening. I know that we're all praying for and thinking of the families of all involved, but I also know that many of us are frustrated with the idea that some want to only offer thoughts and prayers. As a person of faith, I believe that prayer is important, but my hope is that prayer will guide us to act and get involved in finding solutions, actual solutions, public policy solutions. And for that to happen, our legislators have to hear from us. We have to be willing to engage in those conversations or things will not change. And maybe we go into those conversations with a hint of righteous anger. We hear things like, we'll never forget or never again. And I guess it's up to us to see how long that lasts. I know for me that as long as I see that honor roll certificate on the refrigerator, I'll be reminded that somewhere else across the state, there's an empty chair at another father's dinner table. And hopefully that will be enough to keep me engaged in this work. We'll talk more in the coming weeks about public schools and public education policy. But for today, thanks for indulging us as we grieve and process the horrific events of last week. Joining us for today's conversation is Ellen Williams, who was originally scheduled to be with us today to talk about school finance and vouchers. She's been with us before, and you all loved her during the legislative session last year. But today she's joining us not with her professional hat on because we're recording on Friday, May 27th. And after the horrific killings at Robb Middle School in Uvalde, Texas, I don't think either one of us have the heart to talk about public school finance or school vouchers or charter schools today. So she is still going to join us today, but is wearing the hat as a mom, a longtime public school and child advocate. And we're just going to talk some about the experiences of last week. And Ellen, I hope you'll be able to join us again in a few weeks to talk about those other important issues. But for today, thanks for the time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And I don't really know where to start with this conversation because I know Tuesday I started getting the text alerts middle of the day. And at the time it sounded like, there was a small school shooting. And I'll be honest, this happens so often that I didn't pay a ton of attention to it until that evening when, not to minimize like any school shooting, but the gravity of it didn't hit me until that evening when I started seeing the news come out. You were not sitting at your desk getting text alerts on this. Why don't you tell us about where you were when you got the news?
We had an all-day legislative hearings over at the Texas Capitol. The Public Education Committee in the House and the Senate Education Committee both were holding hearings on Tuesday, and numerous school superintendents, the Commissioner of Education, and others were there at the Capitol, and the news reports started rolling in. The commissioner asked for a moment of silence. We'd heard that there were 2 children killed. And then they continued on for a few hours more of discussions. And the House had 4 hours of testimony on mental health. But as more and more of the horrific reports came in, the House Public Ed Committee chair adjourned the meeting. And I got in my car and just sobbed. It's such a horrific event that happened in Uvalde.
I was going to say, I have kids. You have kids. We all know people who have kids.
Yeah.
What kind of impact does this have?
I think a lot of Texas parents, a lot of folks I know, we've shed more tears, said more prayers, gotten less sleep this week. I think this is a turning point.
Yeah.
The status quo is unacceptable.
Yeah, it really hit me that night. I have a 6-year-old who I just had to kick out of the room to record this podcast. But he heard the news. We didn't even have like a long conversation about it or anything, but he heard the news and said that if somebody came to his classroom, that he would hit them with a shovel. And I was like, he's 6, right? Like, how is this the reality that we're living in? The other piece that hit me that night was I saw the picture of the father who was holding the daughter, or the picture of his daughter who had the honor roll picture that she'd received, and we'd been to our public school that morning and watched our child get the exact same award. And so I think it's definitely hitting both parents and kids. We're still in the shadow of this horrific event taking place, and there will be a lot of time in the weeks and months to come to think about how the legislature should respond to school safety and all of the other issues that are at play here. But what has the legislature done to address this in the past?
The legislature has done quite a lot. We had the May 2018 was the Santa Fe shooting. And after that, the governor convened roundtables. The Senate had some committee hearings. They actually did some response in the 2019 legislative session. They passed a school safety allotment that initially it was going to be $50 per student. It ended up being $9.72 per student to allow schools to do things like hardening, training, to allow for mental health services. And schools didn't really receive enough state money to make the types of physical improvements that they also passed some legislation on school marshal programs, which I think a lot of school districts are employing to try to keep kids safe. And schools have done a remarkable job of trying to work with the resources that they have and do the kinds of training and infrastructure that will help keep schools safe. But even with all of the resources that schools have put into school safety, it wasn't enough in Uvalde. Uvalde did a lot of the right things. And even so, we had a 18-year-old who bought 2 AR-15s on his 18th birthday, walk into that school and slaughter an entire classroom. I mean, let's talk about American culture. I'm a Texan. My dad had a rifle from a young age, and he hunted. He brought food in and income for his family when he was a teenager. I grew up shooting and learning respect for guns as a tool. But now people treat guns differently. Our country has deified guns while diminishing God. Our country is essentially offering our children as a sacrifice, bloody, blown to pieces, unrecognizable. Offering our precious children as a sacrifice to a false God. Our country has deified liberty over the command to love. Our country has split into tribes of hate that dehumanize the other. This is where we are as an American culture. Teachers are being demonized, and we need to start with loving our teachers. Write them a thank you note. It's the last day of school. Send them an email. Thank our teachers. Deliver cookies to school. Let's elevate the teaching profession and stop demonizing it. And let's love our children and teachers by holding accountable those who refuse to act and those who refuse to stop the bloody and brutal sacrifice of our children.
Ellen, I could hear the emotion in your voice there and see it on your face since we're on a Zoom screen. And I think you're that emotion is what many parents, many people of faith, many people of good conscience throughout the state are feeling right now, are feeling this week. And I like the suggestion to care for our teachers. I remember after Sandy Hook, our church decided to raise some money and bought I don't remember if it was a Starbucks gift card, but had a gift package for every teacher at the school and brought it up 2 days after as a way to just say, we love you, we thank you. I think there are certainly ways that we can show appreciation to teachers and staff in public schools right now, because it's been a long couple of years for them.
It has.
So I appreciate that suggestion.
Yeah.
And that was a solid list of things we could do with our kids this year. Anything else? I mean, this is a public policy podcast, and I don't know if we're at a place now where we can start giving recommendations to folks, but what do you hope folks will be thinking about in the weeks to come as they communicate with legislators?
The schools cannot do this on their own, and nor can churches, who are also sites where you have shootings, or Walmart where you have shootings, or any other place. I think that anyone who tries to blame shift onto schools that they didn't do enough is missing the point of why this violence is happening and how it's happening and where it's coming from.
Well, Ellen, I really appreciate the conversation today. I wish we could have been talking about public school, public education policy here in the state of Texas. That is an important conversation that needs to be had. But I appreciate you opening yourself up today and having this conversation instead. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you again in a few weeks. But thanks again for the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
This week's episode was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, and the COVID Collaborative.
Joining us for today's weekly watch list is Texas Impact's Advocacy Director, Joshua Houston. Josh, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Scott.
So we're supposed to be talking about election results today. I know that is something everybody's been watching, but I feel like we have to start with the big news of the week. We are recording this on Friday, May 27th, and I didn't realize how big of a story Uvalde was until I got on Twitter to look for election results on Tuesday evening, and it just hit me in the face. So I feel like we have to start with any quick thoughts, quick reactions from what happened, the tragic school shooting in Uvalde.
Yeah, I was sitting in a Starbucks, and it was nauseating. It's nauseating for personal reasons. I have been thinking about what clothing my daughter's wearing when I drop her off for school in the morning. Because if you've paid attention to the news, it's DNA by which they're identifying some of the victims, children. I'm nauseated because of the gridlock, because we seem just more balkanized than we were at the beginning of this week. It seems that the only two possible positions are to have guns everywhere and then no guns at all and no actual policy conversation. And I'm nauseated because I saw a thing from a Princeton University professors where they studied these things, and in 3 days is the average in which the anger dissipates after one of these things. And that's nauseating to think about as we approach the weekend. And frankly, the only solution, and this is not a thing a lobbyist who loves policy likes to say, but the only solution is an electoral one. The elected officials are doing what 600,000 voters in Texas are telling it to do. In this last election cycle, which is what we're coming to talk about, to tell you just how important an NRA endorsement is, there was a local consulting firm, a big consulting firm on the Republican side, that issued an apology on one of the things that only insiders see, but the apology was that they had accidentally said that the NRA had rated somebody at a certain level, and it wasn't an incumbent, it was just a mess up. It was a challenger who had no record, so therefore could not be rated. But that's how, desperate Republicans are. To win in a primary, they feel like they need that NRA endorsement. So they are doing exactly what their voters are telling it to do. And this was a consultant not on the extreme side, but on the traditional side of the Republican Party. The courts aren't coming to save us on this. There's no impact litigation that's going to fix this. Churches, we love direct service, but there's no direct service in our way out of this. We can pay for funerals, but how many funerals are we going to pay for before we do something that's not direct service to try to solve it? What level of civil disobedience would be effective? How do you civilly disobedient your way out of this? What are you even being disobedient against? So that brings me to the only solution is an electoral one. So let's talk about process a little bit. There are 7,200 bills on average that are filed every session. Roughly 1,000 pass. Most you never hear about because they are truly not partisan. There are probably about 25 partisan bills that pass every session, and that's kind of high, actually, that really cause great division. Nevertheless, the issue of guns is one of these. It has become a completely partisan issue, which means if you want to do something about it, really you have two opportunities. You have the primaries of the parties to try to inject your issue and bring about change. And we've just finished one of those two opportunities. And then you have the general election in November. So your first opportunity for the March primary is over, and we're going to talk about what happened in it. And then your second opportunity is in the general. So you really only have one opportunity to do something about this before they reconvene in January of 2023 for the 88th legislature.
Josh, I know you're a parent. I'm a parent. I've talked to a lot of parents, talked to a lot of teachers over the course of the last few days. I don't see this anger dissipating in 3 or 4 days, and I imagine that we will have many more conversations about this topic over the course of the next few weeks, over the next few months, and as we head into election season. And as you mentioned, the field is now set for the November elections. We've talked for weeks about the primary elections and the importance of them. What did you see this week?
Yeah, so this week there's a big overview. If there are elections that are seismic, this was not one of them. It's kind of the opposite of a seismic election. It was a real kind of mixed bag. The message is just more of the same. On the Democratic side, you had some progressive wins. You had some moderate wins. On the Republican side, you had some traditional wins, some extremist wins. It kind of depends on what level you're looking at. At the statewide, there's no change. I mentioned the 600,000 voters. This is the level I was talking about, where there's still 600,000 voters that control the state. These are the people who go in at a statewide level and elect the most extreme candidates that were also the candidates in 2014. It is pretty much the same outcome as the 2014 election. There is one big difference that we should talk about, though. In 2014, there were 19 million Texans that were of the voting age population. In 2022, it's 22 million, and yet still 600,000 votes. That's 3 million more people abdicating their voice to the 600,000. At a Senate level, the Senate is arguably worse than before, but it was already kind of an impossible chamber to work with. So you could also argue there's not much change. It has belonged to the lieutenant governor, increasingly so. So while some of the individuals are probably a little more extreme, most of the Senate has done whatever lieutenant governor tells it to do. So I'm not sure how much change there will or won't be. Within the House as a whole, it's about the same. Because of redistricting and population growth, it is slightly more, and I'm going to make this distinction between suburban and exurban. Exurban areas I'm kind of defining as like they weren't a suburb just 20 years ago. It was rural land 20 years ago. You can think of a lot of places in Collin and Fort Bend and Williamson County, Hayes County, Central Texas that are like this. It is more exurban than rural than it was. But by and large, the House is largely the same. That only kind of plays out when we talk about issues. When you look at the results based on issues, we talked about in a previous episode how one or two House races can have an outsized influence on all 150 members. If there's a silver lining on LGBT equality, it did not get worse. And I want to say it that way intentionally. You can't argue it got any better, but you can argue it didn't get any worse. You had 3 races that all came out towards the not rancid candidate, I guess is kind of the way you want to say it. Not anybody who's going to be brave. Not rancid
candidate.
Right. So cowardice prevailed over rancidity, I guess is one way to say it. So that's a silver lining. On public education, it was kind of a mixed bag. There were 8 races in the House, 6 on the Republican side, 2 on the Democratic side that we were kind of watching. The public education community arguably went 1 for 1 on the Democratic side. There is a bit of a South Texas problem where you have to really hold those Democrats more accountable. And that's because of a large Catholic influence. And of course, vouchers is a thing that the Catholic Church has been after since the 1800s. And then you have on the Republican side, the public education candidates going 3 for 3. And the real difference there was kind of geographical, frankly. So I want to come back to this rural versus suburban versus exurban phenomenon. In the rural communities, it was 100% public education. The vote, all 3 of 2. Well, anyway, I can't remember the exact number, but all the rural candidates that were pro-public education won. And then you have this suburban exurban divide. We talked a little bit about it when we reviewed school board races. If you want to go back and check out that podcast, it was a lot like the school board races. Down ballot kind of signaled how this was going to go, where you have an outer ring of new suburbs or exurbs that are kind of neo-white flight. And then you have an inner ring of older suburbs that are much more diverse. And in the diverse regions, the pro-public education candidate prevailed. And in the more neo-white flight areas that are wealthy and predominantly white, that's where you had the voucher candidates, the privatization candidates, charter school candidates prevail.
Josh, appreciate the time. There is certainly a lot to watch over the course of the next few weeks. But friends, I'll just remind us today that it's all going to come back to elections. And so election season, general election season begins now. It's time to start getting to work.
Yeah, stay angry, my friends.
Thanks, Josh. Joining us for today's response is Texas Impact Foundation Board President and friend of the program, Beaman Floyd. Beaman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We thought you would be an appropriate guest to bring in today for the response because you do have so many connections with public schools in Texas. And since we are talking public schools in the response to the Uvalde shooting today, I wonder if you first just have reactions to both the conversation with Ellen and to what you've seen over the course of the last week. And I guess I just wonder how folks in schools are feeling this week.
Yeah, I think in a word, terrible.
Yeah.
This is this tragedy to people who work in schools is so visceral. And it's such an everyday. The rhythm and flow of the school day is such an everyday thing to them, and to have such a just tragic, horrifying thing happen in a school day in Uvalde is just, it's shocking, and it is terrible, and I think it's hitting everybody in Texas close to home, and of course, in a very particular way, those people who have spent their careers and their love and their sweat and their toil in schools. This is an impossible thing to digest, I think.
You have any thoughts as to why this keeps happening to schools? I know we've talked about the impact it has on kids and parents, but it seems like every year, every few months, we're talking about schools again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to note that it's also happened in grocery stores and in Walmarts and in nightclubs and in concerts, and
Right.
In the case of Las Vegas. So I think that's part of what's so difficult about this is that the schools really leap out at you because they are such a place of youth and a place where our precious children are gathered, and institutions of community stability.
Right.
And so for a shooting to happen there really jumps out at you. I think part of what we have to really wrestle with, though, is that this is a terrible thing that happened at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, but it's a societal problem.
Right.
Just because there's such a tremendous poignancy to this thing happening in schools. When we really approach this thing from the standpoint of public policy and what as a society are we going to do, I think it would be wrong to say this is a school problem. It's a societal problem that has been visited just absolutely gruesomely on schools.
So with that answer, it is a societal problem. There are a lot of different ways that we need to respond, but focusing on the schools, every time we see one of these in a school, we hear never again, never again, never again, which implies that we're going to try to do something different next time. And I know the legislature did make some attempts post Sandy Hook, and Ellen mentioned in the last conversation that there was some kind of response. So what did that look like, and what should we be looking at moving forward in terms of how we respond to this time?
Sure. There were a host of bills related to school hardening and basically thinking in terms of physical security at schools. There was, as Ellen mentioned, an allotment created for that purpose. And some progress has been made in schools. There were bills related to requirements for schools to have an active shooter plan, active shooter protocols, and drills to practice those things. But I think that's sort of the point that I'm making about it not necessarily being strictly a school problem. Yes, you can say that because schools, for whatever reason, tend to be targets of people who want to do terrible, anarchic, chaotic violence because they are there in the community and maybe even symbols of the community. At the same time, you've got to say, can we make our schools into these sort of hardened fortresses? Is that actually really realistic?
Right.
I will tell you a personal story about that. My wife is a high school teacher. She has been a high school teacher for 26 years. Her last day as a public educator was yesterday.
Hey, congratulations to her.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience, and she loved it. She loved the children. She loved the school. She loved everything about it. When she first started teaching, I used to take coffee to her from time to time. And a couple of her work associates, I'd stop at the Starbucks and get 4 coffees and take them up there and chit-chat for a few minutes in the morning before class, and then go my merry way while she did the Lord's work. And over the course of years, that became completely impossible. That subsequent to violence at schools and security issues related to schools, we got to the point where when I would go to the school to see her in the last few years. I would have to produce a driver's license. There's a single point of entry. They would run my driver's license. I'd have to have a name tag that had a printout of my driver's license on the name tag so that everybody could know who I was. And so I was essentially, it made the casual visit by the community to the school impossible. Now, on the one hand, you can say this is great, right? This is forward-looking. This is responding to this violence that's happened to us. On the other hand, you say, how much further can we go before the schools really aren't part of the community anymore? Where you can't have the normal people coming to events, people coming to volunteer, people coming to support the classrooms because the security protocols are so difficult, and spontaneous community support of the schools becomes virtually impossible. And at the same time, we're not looking at other issues, those societal issues related to guns and gun availability, issues related to the broad issue of mental health, not just in schools, but in the community generally. We have to really use every tool in the toolbox here, in my opinion, Scott. And what we have done is we've been very focused on the schools, which is not a bad thing. But you can't ignore every other option that you have in favor of hardening, bunkerizing the schools, making entrance and egress impossible. It is really hard to see how you can have the school as a center of a community, which is the beauty of public schools, which is what they often are in our state historically and currently. You've got to look at all the options to address this issue and not just the school option.
You've mentioned guns, gun policy. You've also mentioned mental health, which is a topic that always comes up when these type of occurrences take place. Has the legislature done anything there, and do they have room to run? What does addressing mental health look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that mental health is a huge subset of health. And we have strong debates in this state about health policy in terms of the funding of healthcare policy, in terms of availability in a lot of our areas, including rural areas. A lot of times those are dollars and cents debates. A lot of times they're debates related to the relationship between Texas and the federal government. Medicaid is a huge part of that debate, and the support for Medicaid program and the expansion of Medicaid. There aren't hard boundaries. You can't have, in my opinion, you can't have a bill that just says, okay, we're going to have a bill that improves the mental health of people in Texas without looking at the structures of healthcare delivery and how those things work. This is what I mean by every tool in the toolbox. I think that, it is hard to say. You can do the forensic investigation of the people who do the shooting in these tragic events and say, what was the issue? What was the cause? What sort of tipped them into that space of terrible violence without any thought of consequences or self-destructive, a self-destructive thought of consequence. But I think that saying, well, we're going to target this one thing that's happening in our society and not address the sort of broader issues that create a vulnerable population, I just think that that is a poor approach. I think you have to look at this as a systemic issue.
I had a chance to preach this last Sunday at a historically Black church, and then left directly from there to annual conference where this topic came up time and time again. And the prevailing theme among the folks I was around, at least, was thoughts and prayers aren't enough. We have to do something. And then, they'd look at the guy that works for Texas Impact and says, so what do we do? And so I told them they should listen to the podcast this week because I'm still figuring it out myself. So I guess, Beaman, on behalf of all those people who asked me this week, what do we do? We're always encouraging folks to talk to their legislatures, but what's the message right now?
Well, I would hope that the message is having real conversations about all of our options. Part of what I find interesting about this, and this probably goes most directly to the question of guns, If you're talking about an incident of gun violence, you say who, what, where, who is doing the violence, what were they using to commit the violence, and where did they perpetrate this violence? And it seems to me like we're very hesitant politically, generally, about the what, about the what are you using to perpetrate this violence? You got to be able to talk about that. You have to be able to have a conversation about that. You can't have a situation where somebody comes and says, well, that's off the table. And I think that our people should say, yeah, that's not off the table. Every tool in the tool. I mean, we may have the conversation and eventually decide that the what is a pernicious problem that we can't solve, but not having the conversation is crazy.
Right.
And so I think that we need, and I will tell you and again, this goes to this is such a personal issue. It's funny, that everybody says, well, this is my personal view on this. I think that's important because this is so visceral. Because I have kids that grew up in the public school system. I had a wife that taught in the public school system. There, from time to time, there were scary things that would happen, and I would think, wow, my wife's in an institutional situation where there's an expectation of the potential for violence. If you can't have a conversation when that's the effect on everybody in this state, what are you doing?
Right.
I will tell you that I have these conversations with, I was in the military. My family is a military family. My father was a Marine. My brother was in the Army. I was in the Army. We are, grew up in that paradigm of firearms when I was a kid, and I love to shoot. I'm a person who enjoys going out. My brother says that it's my yoga because my heart rate goes down 20 beats a minute. When I get over a rifle to do target practice. We all think that there are sensible limits with regard to access to firearms. As a family, we have this discussion and have been having this discussion for decades. And I mean, if we can have it, if sixth generation Texans can have it, if people from the military can have it, if people who enjoy, my dad's a big sporting clay shooter and has been his whole life. If we're willing to sit down and have that conversation with each other as a family and with our friends, why can't we have it as a matter of public policy?
Right.
I think that's the demand.
Good advice, Beaman. Really appreciate that. Any closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with today?
Yeah. I mean, I think thoughts and prayers are being castigated, but as a person of faith, I think they're important. I think it's where action starts. It's certainly not where our effort should stop. But I would encourage prayers and encourage thought, and then move forward into demanding, which is sometimes hard for people of faith. But I think it's important in this. Demanding good faith effort to sit down and talk about the entire issue.
Absolutely. If we can get theological for a second, that's actually one of the things I said on Sundays. Thoughts and prayers are important, but the piece of thoughts and prayers that we often leave out is the part where we listen for guidance for what our next step should be.
We are of one mind. You bet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Beaman, really appreciate the time today. Thanks for all you do, and
okay.
We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank our guests today, Ellen Williams, Josh Houston, and Beaman Floyd. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. It has been a rough week for many of us and is yet another reminder that public policy and elections matter. We'll work to bring relevant conversations and public policy information to you, but it's up to each of us to do the work to bring about the change our communities and children need. I hope that you'll take some time this week to think and pray about what steps you can take to get involved in the policy process, how you'll communicate with your legislators, and how you'll mobilize your networks to vote. I don't really know what else to say. So thanks for joining us today. We hope you'll share this content with your friends and congregations. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content, so hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. And there's a lot going on, so keep an eye on Texas Impact social media for upcoming announcements, or email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Friends, these are wild and sometimes dangerous times, and 2022 is an important year for democracy in our communities. The world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnett, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.